Let's bow our heads in prayer. Brother Scotty, would you lead us, please?
Lord, we thank you for being in your house tonight. Lord, we thank you for your many blessings, Lord. Thank you for your presence tonight, Lord. We ask you, Lord, that you would prepare our hearts and our minds for your word tonight, Lord. Bless Brother Brand as he brings the word, Lord, that he would be able to bring it in such a way, Lord, that it would be as you would have it in our hearts tonight, Lord. Lord, we ask you to see each one that's here and bless them, Lord, and those that couldn't make it tonight, Lord. We ask you that you would keep your hand upon us all this night, Lord, in Jesus' name we pray.
Let's turn to number 146. Number 146. Bill West.
Number 463.
In the ring book?
Yeah, in the ring book. Sing the first and last.
Anybody else need one of these papers? There's some extras up here if you need one. I know last Wednesday night that we had Brother Williams, newly licensed preacher from State Line, and so that we didn't continue in our study concerning alcohol. I want to pick up with this tonight, and I was kind of glad he could come last week because I've probably done more studying for this study tonight than I have in a long time on anything, and it did at least give me another extra week to try to get some things straight in my mind. And I decided to go ahead and outline what I want to try to go over with you tonight. A lot of this is going to be factual, informational. We are going to turn to some scriptures. We're not going to do a lot of application tonight. I want to try to lay the foundation with just the facts this week, and then next week I want to move into how that applies and move into some things like John chapter 2 and other places in the scriptures where that maybe there are things such as wine that are mentioned and scriptures that have caused a lot of people a lot of questions down through the years. So I felt like it would probably be better for me to just give you this, and we'll try to just follow this, as close as we can as the Lord leads. And I hope it could be a help to you in trying to stay up with me and read along with me tonight. Now, of course, that this is our third study in this series, and we've looked at a couple of things. The first study was just some general statements concerning alcohol and strong drink, and then we looked at addiction a couple of weeks ago. We looked at several characters in the Bible who dealt with addictions, and some of those were addiction to strong drink. There are other addictions, I believe, that we can, when we look on the pages of Scripture, there are other things we can see that people were addicted to, even though maybe the word addiction was not used because of their actions. And so tonight, as I put here, and I tried to be very careful the way that I said this. I want you to understand very, very plainly my stance, and I'm going to say this. I'm settled on alcohol. I'm not unsettled whether it's right or it's wrong. I'm settled in my heart concerning that, and I don't want you to misunderstand the statement. Let me just read the statement. It says, I'm going to try to delve into a topic that admittedly I've not been able to get settled on. And again, not whether it's right or wrong, but there's some things in the Scripture, some statements that are made, some examples, some accounts that we read, that when you read them, I'll be honest with you, I just never have gotten settled on them. People have asked me questions about them, and I just don't know. And so what I'm trying to do is answer some of these questions in my mind. And one of those questions is the next bullet point there, the use of the word wine in the Bible. There's a lot of different opinions on that. And yet that I believe we dig into it, we find some facts. And we don't just have to go by, well, I think this or I think that, or here's what I believe. Well, that'll get you in trouble. Here's what I believe. And so that's what I'm trying to do in this, is trying to help us get a clear understanding of really what the Bible, what is it talking about? What is the lesson that's trying to get across, to us? When you look at the word wine, and we'll get to that word maybe a little bit later tonight in the study, but there's times in the Bible that it's spoken in a very negative light. It is spoken in a very negative light. Wine is a mocker. We've already looked at strong drink is raging. Whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. And Many other examples in the Scriptures where wine is spoken of in a negative light, but there's places in the Scriptures where it's neutral. It's not positive or negative. And then you go to things such as sacrifices that in which wine was to be brought. You read about other times in the Scriptures, even in some sense, it's being spoken of in a positive way. And, how can that be? The Bible doesn't contradict itself, so how could it be that one place maybe it's cast in a negative light, another place is cast in a neutral light, or maybe even in a positive light? And that's what I want to try to help us to understand. As we go on to this little disclaimer that I have here, I think our biggest issue in trying to study on this topic are two things. And the first is of going into it unbiased. I've already told you that my stance on alcohol is, even through this study, it's not changed a bit. If nothing else, it's firmed up my stance on where I stand. I was taught that need to stay away from it. It's not a good thing. That it's very dangerous. I still believe that. I believe the Bible teaches that. And yet that if we go into it with just presuppositions and biases, then it'll skew maybe the facts here. So, and that's hard for us to go into it unbiased. I think the biggest problem is the second thing that I mentioned here is we try to take our culture, and I gave an example of our customs, our technology, our manners. We try to put the Bible into our world, into our culture, into our technology. And they lived in a different world. They lived in a different day. They lived in a different culture. They lived in a day where technology was different. I didn't say right and wrong was different. I didn't say that at all. Right and wrongs, look, it's not, truth is not conditional. It's not at all. Truth is absolute. And so what's right then is right now, and what's wrong then is still wrong now, to be wrong or right throughout eternity. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's difficult for us because we didn't live in that world. We didn't grow up in that world. We've never been a part of that culture for us to place ourselves in their culture and to think like they thought. And really tonight, that's what I'm trying to get us to do. It's really maybe just to try the best that we can to put ourselves into their culture, to understand exactly what the Bible is teaching here. Now, I approach this in this way. Let's look just at some informational things to start with. And the first thing that I want us to look at is, what did they have to drink in those days? And I don't mean drink in an alcoholic way. I just mean to drink. What did they eat with their, when they ate a meal? What did they have to drink with their meals? What did they have to drink to quench their thirst? And the first thing that I want us to look at is what they didn't have. So let's just go ahead and count some things out that they didn't have. And the first thing, they didn't have carbonated drinks. I think we all understand that. Probably goes without saying. I went back, tried the carbonated water. 1767 is when that was developed. So that's obviously didn't have that. So that would eliminate Cokes and soft drinks and all of those things. Didn't have coffee. Boy, how'd they live, huh? Didn't have coffee. They said coffee came around the 15th century. So it's been around a long time. Some of you, I go to your house, you serve lemonade. Well, lemonade is from the 1600s. They didn't have that. I thought about tea. I looked in the Bible, and I couldn't find tea mentioned anywhere in the Bible, unless I missed it. Now, I don't think I did. I don't find anywhere where tea is mentioned in the Bible. Tea was a thing in that day, but it was not a thing in that part of the world. You go back and look at the Chinese, they're the ones that tended, from what I understand, developed that, and it was not in the Middle East, in that part of the world. So let's just go ahead and count all those things out. They didn't have any of those things. So what did they have? All right. The first thing that I want to mention is they had water. They had water. And I give you several ways in which that they could get water. There may be others. I may have missed something. I tried not to, but I may have. And let's just talk about those. The first one's wells. They would dig wells. Turn to the book of Genesis. I have it listed here. Genesis chapter 29. Look at some examples here. In Genesis chapter 29. Wells would tap into an underground source of water. Most of the wells, from what I can determine, were not wells that just had runoff that ran into them, but they actually, as ours do now, they tapped into underground sources of water. Genesis chapter 29, we read here concerning Jacob as he would go back to his mother's family. It says this in Genesis chapter 29, verse 1. And Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. He looked, and behold, a well in the field, and lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks. And here's what I wanted you to see. And a great stone was upon the well's mouth. Question, why did they put a stone on top of the well? Yeah, it was to try to keep contamination out, no doubt. And evidently it was a pretty substantial stone because, the question, well, who's going to, basically, if I remember correctly, they're waiting for somebody to come along and to take the stone off the well so that they can water the sheep. Verse 3, and thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the sheep, and put the stone again into the well's mouth in its place. Jacob said unto them, my brethren, whence be ye? And they said, of Haran are we. And he said unto them, know ye Laban the son of Nahor? They said, we know him. He said unto them, is he well? They said, he is well. Behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with the sheep. And he said, lo, it is yet high day, neither is it the time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go out and feed them. And they said, we cannot until all the flocks be gathered together, and until they roll the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep. So evidently from the statements made here, Brother Dwayne, they must have been very careful not to take that off too early. They didn't want anything to blow in it, to fall down in it. So they said, we're going to get everything ready. Then we'll take the cover from off the well. Verse 9, and while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. It came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. What I want you to see here is just the fact that they tried to keep this water as clean as it could be. But go over with me to the book of John chapter 4. John chapter 4. Now, every time we read about a well, we don't read about a stone covering the mouth of the well. We don't read about the well being covered. So evidently, that was not something that was, mandatory or something they always did. And I don't know the reasons why. Maybe some did it and some didn't do it. But we come here to John chapter 4, and I'm just pointing something out. I'm just trying to lay a foundation. Jesus is talking to this woman at Jacob's well. And in verse 11, the woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? I won't go through all the account. The woman simply, from a practical standpoint, Jesus has offered her living water, and she tells him this, how you going to get it? You didn't bring anything with you to draw it with. All right, so what does that tell us about Jacob's well? There was nothing left there to get that was just left there permanently that people could come up and maybe lower a bucket with a rope or whatever. You had to bring your own. You don't have anything. Where are you going to get this? And so what they would do is they had a leather pouch and they would bring a rope. She said this well is deep. And they would lower that down into that well to where the water began. They would fill it up and they would draw it back up. Now, my question is this. You reckon those ropes in that pouch is always clean? I know we get, even a lot of us have wells and pumps at home, and, we draw water out of the ground, and the ground has a way of purifying all that, but we have it pretty sealed, it's pretty airtight, and that nothing can get in it to contaminate it, but they didn't. And so I just wanted you to see here that even the water in these wells, that no doubt that there was contaminants in it, there were things that would cause it to be impure. All right? Go over to 2 Kings chapter 18. Now, the second source of water would be cisterns. 2 Kings chapter 18. We used to listen to a preacher on the radio when I was a kid coming home from church on Sunday night. He had how most preachers have a habit, they'll repeat, have little sayings they repeat over and over. His deal was brethren and cistern. And my daddy would always say, a cistern's a well. Cistern's a well. And they were. The difference in a cistern and a well was that a cistern simply collected water that fell. Probably some of you do it. Maybe off the eave of your house or something like that, you'll put big buckets to collect rainwater. That's what a cistern was. And it was more of like for one family. They would dig a pit or whatever the case might be, and they would try to collect the rainwater that fell. I would assume probably most of that was used for other things besides just drinking straight. Obviously, there's other things they could use water for. Maybe they would heat the water, or whatever the case might be. But I would think that the water in these cisterns wouldn't be quite as clean as the water in the wells. 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 31. It says, "Hearken not to Hezekiah." This is the words of the king of Assyria. "For thus saith the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me by a present, and come out to me, and then eat ye every man of his own vine, and every one his fig tree, and drink ye every one the waters of his cistern." So you see here that the cistern is spoken of as something that people could use for water. All right, let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 17. Another source of water would be streams. Now, I would say down the list, I'd say streams probably at the bottom of the list as far as the purity of the water, depending on where the stream was. 1 Kings chapter 17. Elijah has gone to the king and told him it's not going to rain or dew for this period of time. In verse 3, the Lord told him, he said, "Get thee hence and turn thou eastward and hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. It shall be that thou shalt drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there." So you see that Elijah, that he drank of the brook Cherith. I won't turn to the book of Judges. We could. That's the account. You remember when Gideon was called by God to go and to fight against the enemy, and he had his big army, and he took them down to the water, and depending on how they drank, one group put over here, one group put over there, and that the biggest part of them was sent home. Evidently, they went down to a stream of some kind. It just said they went down to the water. But because of the way that they drank, it was some sort of I don't think it would have been a pond or something of that nature, but probably some moving water, some sort of a stream. And so you see that again there. Back in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8, let's look at springs for just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 8. And when you think about their culture, you got to even think about where they lived. You know, we all have our place. We live out in the country, and we have our little spread. They didn't do that. They usually lived in walled cities. And so that access to springs would have been something that would probably been pretty rare in those places. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 7. It says, "For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths, that spring out of valleys and hills." There were some springs around the city of Jerusalem. And it's no doubt that probably some of those springs would have pretty good drinking water. So they drank water. The second thing that I want us to see that they had to drink in that day was milk. And I'm not going to take the time to turn to the examples, but throughout the Bible, there's times it speaks of milk from cattle, milk from sheep, milk from goats, and even one place it talks about milk from camels, or it talked about there being milk camels there. So obviously the point of those camels was for them to be milked. We know milk is very perishable. Let me remind you, there's no refrigeration in their day. I think we know that, but that's very important. There's no refrigeration in that day. So whatever milk they had, either drink it or, make it into cheese, make it into... There's places that it talks about different dairy products in the Bible, so they did know how to make some things out of that to preserve it. But as far as just drinking, obviously that had to be done very quickly before that it would spoil. Juice. Only one time in the Bible the word juice is used, and that's in the book of Song of Solomon, chapter 8 and verse 2. And the juice there is pomegranate juice. Anybody ever had pomegranate juice? I'm not a big juice person. But I know some people really like it. I know some people's gone over there that talked about how much they like it. And so that is mentioned in the scriptures. I mentioned some fruits in the Bible. Now these are not, but this is a short list of fruits that are mentioned in the Bible. And I know maybe the almond be a nut, but it does. There's a liquid in it. The point I was trying to make here, that I know people drink that today. But these were some of the fruits that did have some sort of a liquid in them that people could drink. Almonds, apples, grapes. We're going to get to the grapes. Mulberries. We know olives, that would be for oil. And the palm tree, depending on what kind of palm tree it was, that they did have some kind of fruit that maybe they could have made juice out of it. Now let's get to the grape. Let's go to the book of Numbers, chapter 13. Let's hone in on the grape for a few minutes, what time we have left tonight. Because that's really what we're trying to determine is what this word wine that's used in the Bible, what's it talking about? Numbers chapter 13. We know that spies are going to go into the promised land, and that they're going to bring back some things. It tells us in the 20th verse, I didn't put this one on here, but in the 20th verse, notice the last statement in the 20th verse, when those spies got into the land, it said, "Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes." So what season of the year did they go in, did the spies go into the promised land, if it was a time of first ripe grapes? Probably late in the summer. They're just starting to ripen. By the way, their grapes ripen at the same time ours do. We're about the same latitude. From about the end of... Brother Lynn, when do you start getting a few? Ordinarily. From what I read, about the end of July, middle to end of July, until about the beginning to middle of September is about when their grape... Is that be about like ours, Brother Lynn? Pretty close. So theirs is about the same as ours. So we know these spies went in the late summer because it's the time of first ripe grapes. Verse 23, they came unto the brook of Eshcol and cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they bare it between two upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. The place was called the brook Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes which the children of Israel cut down from thence. They returned from searching of the land after 40 days, and they went in and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel unto the wilderness of Paran to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and unto all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. Now, we've been taught from a child about these two men that carried this cluster of grapes on this pole. But I like how it says this here. They showed off when they got back into the camp. They showed off the fruit of the land. That tells you it was something like they had never seen before. And they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. So it's just reiterated over and over and over again how spectacular that these grapes are. This is like nothing we've ever seen. And so that when you think about the land of Israel, let's turn over on the backside. You know, when you think about even in the world, you think about the country probably that we associate most with grapes. That would probably be Italy. They're on the Mediterranean Sea. They have the Mediterranean climate. So is the nation of Israel. It's on the Mediterranean Sea. And I tried to read about the soils and even the topography of the land. It's a pretty ideal place for the growing of grapes. And I've already mentioned to you that their harvest is in late summer like ours. It corresponds to our months of late July to early September. Go to the book of Deuteronomy real quick, to chapter 16. Deuteronomy chapter 16. You're going to see a use of the word wine here. If you'll remember the Feast of Tabernacles, we've dealt with that some in our study of Nehemiah, that it occurred in the 7th month, from the 15th to the 22nd day of the month. That corresponds with our late September, early October. And notice how it's put here. I'd never picked up on this until I was studying for this. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 13. He said, thou shalt observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days after thou hast gathered in thy corn and thy wine. So he said, I'm going to let you do that. And then these feasts, these fall feasts are going to fall right in behind that. So you're going to gather in. And notice, can you gather in wine? You don't gather in wine, do you? You gather in grapes. But you see how that the word wine is used here even real quickly. You see that it's used here for grapes. And they're the fruit of the vine. It's spoken of here as wine. All right, let's move on. I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I hope it don't break under me. Let's think about the grape. The shelf life of the grape is only a few days, unless it's preserved in some way. I think we'd all agree with that, right? They spoil quick. You just leave them out, and they're going to spoil. So there's several ways that people preserved grapes in ancient times, because they've got all of these. They've got a land full of vineyards. They've got all these grapes, pretty reliable crop, as long as they're following God, that He's sending the rain at the right times and the sunshine at the right times. And so during this harvest, they're harvesting piles and piles of these grapes. So you definitely want to try to preserve that. You don't want to go to waste, considering how valuable it is, not just monetarily, but I mean, you think about even water, and we'll get to that later on, maybe not tonight as much, but water was not always dependable. And maybe what you had wasn't as pure as it needed to be. And so you definitely want to have something preserved. Raisins. 1 Samuel chapter 25. Brother Lynn and I were talking about raisins the other day, and he pointed something out to me, and I went back and looked at it. He was exactly right. Raisins are mentioned, I think, 4 times in the Scriptures, 4 or 5. And every time that they're mentioned, it always speaks of clusters or bunches of raisins. It never speaks of a handful of raisins or one raisin, but a cluster of raisins. Well, what does that tell us? They probably let them dry on the vine, didn't they? Or at least picked them in the tags. Didn't take them off one by one. You find it here in 1 Samuel chapter 25, in verse 18. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 sheep ready dressed and 5 measures of parched corn and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on asses. Of course, this is Nabal. He's been ugly to David. David's going to kill him, and she's trying to intervene. What I want you to see here, 100 clusters of raisins. It's a bunch of raisins. Raisins were very popular. From what I've read, it was something that they could preserve easily. Their climate lent itself to preserving these things into raisins. You need a dry climate. You need some hot weather. And they had it. They had rainy seasons. They had dry seasons. And their dry season was dry. It was dependably dry. And so that they probably left these things on the vine until that they were basically dehydrated. And then you had raisins. It was something sweet that they could snack on. I'm trying to think. I'm not going to say it because I may be wrong. The 30th chapter, the book is just a few pages over. He speaks of an Egyptian they found in the field, brought him to David. It said this in verse 12. They gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. When he had eaten, his spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk any water 3 days and 3 nights. His sugar must have been low, right? I mean, it's just stuff like that. That's what makes the Bible come alive, isn't it? I mean, they've dealing with the same problems we were. He hadn't eaten 3 days and 3 nights. He needed to pick me up. And so what did they give him? They gave him something sweet. They gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins. He ate that. Boy, he felt good again. He's ready to go. All right, so raisins were made from... How many of you like raisins? You got any raisin eaters? All right. I remember Brother James Broom talking about going to eat at a house back when a lot of people didn't have a lot. He said, you know, even places that he went that were not clean, he could always find him something to eat. And said he went to one place and, you know, there's just people didn't have much and not the cleanest place he'd ever been. And he spotted there was a sweet potato casserole down the other end of the table. And he said, well, I can make a meal on that. He said, that'd be good enough. They had nice sweet potato casserole, raisins on top of it. He said, so after he asked the blessing, he said, Pastor, I think I'll just make a meal off that sweet potato casserole. He said, pass me that casserole. And he said, when they did, all the raisins flew off. So I'm not sure what he did after that. He didn't tell us the rest of the story, but I don't like raisins. I don't know. Might change your view on raisins. The second thing is vinegar. Numbers chapter 6. Numbers chapter 6. Now, he told the story, so I'm just relaying it to you. Numbers chapter 6. Vinegar. They could preserve grapes by making vinegar. Now, I know we all understand that vinegar is not a drink. It's not something you drink with a meal. but vinegar is spoken of in the Bible on several occasions. Numbers chapter 6, this speaks of the Nazirite vow. Verse 2, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when either man or woman shall separate themselves to vow a vow of a Nazirite, to separate themselves unto the Lord, he shall separate himself. Notice what all he had to separate himself from with this Nazirite vow. From wine and strong drink, and shall drink no vinegar of wine. Notice again, vinegar of wine. And vinegar comes from juice, doesn't come from fermented wine. Or vinegar of strong drink. Neither shall he drink any liquor of grapes, nor eat moist grapes or dried. So this just, you see here several of the things that they made from the grapes, and vinegar is one of them. I'm not going to turn over and read it. My time's getting away from me quick, but in the book of Ruth, chapter 2 and verse 14, when Ruth's out there gleaning in Boaz's field, they stop for lunch. And it talks about Boaz telling her to dip her bread in the vinegar. And I thought, that's kind of strange. I went back and tried to research it a little bit, and the best way I could describe it is they made an ancient energy drink out of vinegar. And it was supposed to quench your thirst when you're hot. And that's probably what they had. They'd been out there working in the fields, gleaning. And so they had this ancient energy drink, and he told her, hey, you dip your bread in there and refresh yourself. Of course, he loved her, and he was trying to get her affection. Matthew chapter 27, I won't turn over and read it. Jesus on the cross, they offered him, I believe it was vinegar mixed with gall, and it said when he tasted thereof, he would not drink. And if I understand that correctly, that they would give that to criminals that hung on a cross, and it was to dull their senses. It was something to take away some of the pain. Of course, that he tread the winepress alone. That he didn't use anything to dull his senses whatsoever. And so vinegar could be made from that. The next one's honey. I know we think of honey, we think of the product of bees, and there's times, most of the time in the Scripture, it does speak of that. But when you go back to the Hebrew, the word is debash. I have that down there. It means to be gummy or syrup. That's what the word honey means in the Hebrew. And they said they would take the juice, the fresh squeezed juice of the grapes, they would boil it to get the water out of it. Of course, it would be a very sweet substance that was left, and that's something that they would preserve. They called it dibs. It would be similar to our jelly. I don't know how prominent that was, but that is something they did. Let's talk about this wine, and then we'll come to a close. It says the most convenient way to preserve large quantities of grape juice was by allowing it to go through the fermentation process. Now, I've read so much the last couple of weeks trying to get all this straight in my mind. If any of this is incorrect, I'll be glad to correct it later. The sugar content found naturally in grapes causes it to ferment when mixed with yeast. So it's already got sugar. The grapes have sugar, pretty high sugar content in them. It needs yeast. That needs to come together for this alcohol to be produced. And this is what I've discovered, that wild yeast, there's yeast that's just in the air, and that's carried from insects and all sorts of things. Wild yeast is present on the skins of the grapes, but not the inside of the grape. But if the skin is broken, even slightly, even if that berry is picked off and it just tears that top a little bit, then the yeast will come in contact with the sugar, and that fermentation process will begin. And what would they do with the grapes when they gathered them? They would take them to the wine press, right? They'd put them in there, and they would actually get in there barefooted, and they would just stomp those grapes. And it would be a big vat, and it would be angled in such a way that the juice would run out through a slot, and they would collect that juice. That's how they did it. Brother Lynn does not do his that way, by the way. Brother Lynn does not make wine either, just in case anybody's watching it. Anyway, That's how they did that process. So once the grapes were squeezed in the wine press, the fermentation process would begin. And from what I can read, I've looked at several different sources, in 2 to 3 weeks, that juice would be converted into wine. Now, let's talk about wine in the Bible. There's 6 different Hebrew words that are translated wine in our King James Bible. There's one of those 6, and I put that word, it's ASIS, is pronounced Alces, I think's how you pronounce it. Of those 6, from what I can tell, it's the only one that can never be fermented wine. That was completely, totally, 100% of the time, just simply grape juice, the fruit of the vine. And you see that it's translated, that pomegranate juice in Song of Solomon 8:2 I mentioned. That's that word, Alces. Sweet wine, a couple of places. New wine, a couple of places in Joel. That's that word, Alces. That has no connotation whatsoever with any kind of fermented wine. The other 5 words that were translated wine in the English language are used in the Bible, in the Hebrew, can refer to the fresh juice, or they can refer to that which is fermented. That's where you have to use your context clues. And I know there's places where we're just not sure, because that it could go either way. Now, difference in their wine and our wine today. Their wine, and when I say wine, I'm talking about fermented stuff now. Again, it can be used either way. But their fermented wine, this is what I discovered. It was what you call natural wine. The distillation process didn't come along for several hundred years later. And there were no modified yeast. There were no modified yeasts that were put in it that are put in wine today. And from what I read, natural wine, this is that is simply using the wild yeast, and it's going through the fermentation process, through the sugar that's in the grapes, nothing's been added, that it can have a maximum alcohol content of no more than 9 to 11%. Now, how does that compare to wine today? Today's distilled wine that uses these modified yeast has between 12 and 20% alcoholic content. So it's about double the alcoholic content as the fermented wine they had in that day would have had. Okay? So, when you think about this ancient wine, I got a question. Since wine quickly fermented after harvest, does that mean that most people in that day were alcoholics? The answer to that is no. Were there alcoholics in that day? Yes. But that does not mean that most people are alcoholics. Now, you won't, as far as I can tell, you won't find this in the Bible. But you go to extra biblical sources, and again, you take those as they are, extra biblical sources, and there's a lot of them, many of them. They all say this, that all civilized people in that day diluted wine with water. The most common ratio, that should be ratio. The most common ratio being 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This was a quote that I found. It was one of the writers of that day. Again, not in the Bible. I should have put it in quotes. He made this statement, that it was said to be harmful to drink water alone, and it was harmful to drink wine alone. Does that make sense? Why would it be harmful to drink water alone? It goes back to what we talked about, the contamination. Now, that does not mean everybody drunk fermented wine. Not at all. I don't want you to think that. And we're going to look at some of this next week. That was just a statement that was made. But it said that no reasonable people drunk wine alone. And so when you take that 3-to-1 water to wine ratio that constituted seemingly a common drink in those days. Now when I say drink, I'm not talking about alcoholic. I'm just talking about what people drank. That it would have ended up being something that was around 2.5% to 3% alcohol content. And from what I can gather, they said that ratio was enough to basically purify the water if it was contaminated, but it essentially eliminated the ability to intoxicate somebody. And again, remember, that's talking about the fermented wine. So that they had that was fermented, even that people abused in that day, was much different than the wine, the strong drink that we have today. And I'm going to say it again, maybe in case somebody came in at the middle of this, watching it. I'm against it. Okay? I'm against it in every way. I don't believe it's got any place for us today to be using it. It's harmful. I think I tried to get that across last time we studied it. What I'm trying to get us to see, just trying to answer some questions, that what was the wine in the Bible? What did it consist of? What did it constitute? How alcoholic was it? All right? We're going to stop there. Like I said, Lord willing, next week, I want to go to the Scriptures, and I want to look at some of these things like John chapter 2. I believe we have a clear answer in John chapter 2 about what Jesus made at the marriage of Cana of Galilee. And I'm going to keep that till next week. I believe the answer is very clear by some statements that are made here. Once we understand this, what I've tried to teach us tonight, I believe it's very clear what Jesus made. And it's not going to disappoint you when I tell you what he made. He didn't make something they got drunk on. We're going to find he made something better than what they had. And it was impossible for somebody to get drunk off of it. It was something that was pure. And we'll see that. Anybody have a question on any of this? I'll try to answer it if you have it. All right. Brother Herschel, you get us a song. We'll have a verse of invitation. I know we've studied the Bible. You may have something on your heart. If the Lord's moving you, you come.